So the first speaker we've got this evening is Leah, and I'm just going to say a few words about Leah as a way of introduction to the Sangha, for those who don't know Leah and for those who do as well. So I asked Leah to give the talk the other day, and she was just immediately yes. And, you know, that's really delighted that she was just this very, very quick yes. And I've had the pleasure of knowing Leah over the last few years. And I wrote a few things down that I thought about that came to mind immediately about her, actually. One is integrity. She's got really strong integrity. She's committed, absolutely committed to the Dharma, committed to the Hartford group, and just really gives herself to the Hartford situation. She's a fantastic friend. You know, she's a good friend to me, and she's a good friend to many people. And she's very, very supportive of people who are wanting to practice the Dharma. Really wants to support them to practice and do everything to help the Dharma, the three jewels, thrive. She's very generous, and also she's got a real eye for beauty. And she loves art, and she's got this very aesthetic sort of way of being. And sometimes I've had communication with Leah, and she'll suddenly send me some very, very beautiful image. And it's really delightful. I think she lives a bit on that plane. And Leah's been invited for ordination. She's been waiting for her ordination retreat, and she'll be heading off next year, all being well, up to Akashavana. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Leah.
Thank you, Jyoti. Well, there's several Dharma talks that I could have given on this theme, because there's so many Dharma teachings that, well, changed my life and are changing my life. And so it's on that last note, what's changing my life, that I've decided to give this particular talk. So for me, living a Dharma life is unfolding all the time. And it's alive and it's mysterious. And so it's not something out there that I study or in a book, but it's a relationship perhaps with reality that's transforming me. So what I'm going to share tonight is about a teaching that's currently active, and it's in process of this transformation work. So it's a cycle that isn't yet complete, a story that's not concluded. And that makes me a little bit vulnerable, because, you know, I'm exposing work in progress. It's not something neatly tied up and, you know, this is what happened to me and there it is and that's what happened in my transformation. It's really alive. So I guess in a way I'm able to do that because of my faith in the Dharma. So here goes. I think as well, it's really important to say there's a magic in how teachings arrive. So why it lands on one day and not another, and you know why it moves one person and not another. So that's the essence of the verse that I received, and you know, I'll try and convey that as best I can. So it arrived in the post on a little slip of paper from my friend Naina, who many of us know in the Sangha. She was at T. Ratnaloka several years ago, and she sent me a card, as she often does, and she'd received this verse in a ritual, and it felt really significant that she sent it to me, so I put it on my shrine and I read it from time to time. And although I knew the verse, it meant more. And at the same time, by going for refuge, my practice of the Dharma had deepened. Yeah, it was almost like I'd steered to the deep. And around that year, in about 2015, I was at Dharma Kosha and I met Padmasambhava in meditation, which was both profoundly beautiful and deeply unsettling. So the following year, I sought counsel from Sangharajta about it. And here I could detail the teaching that he gave me about inner and outer not being separate, but actually that's a different talk for another time. what it showed me was something much deeper in transformation needed to happen, whether I liked it or not, whether I wanted it or not. So I took this further, and I dived into the River of Soul with Attila and co. And those who haven't heard of it, it's a 6-month process group around myth. And again, it was deeply beautiful and deeply unsettling at the same time. And it was during this time that the teaching found me again. And it was like my unconscious delivered it back to me. I had a really powerful dream, which apparently is very common when you do the River of Soul. I walked down a wooden staircase in this dream and entered this wooden basement room. And there was a circle of chairs with people seated. And I stood before them, and I just spoke clearly the words that had arrived on this piece of paper all those years before. And I didn't even know that I really knew it, but I did in the dream. And it was, call forth as much as you can of love, of respect, and of faith. Remove the obstructing defilements and clear away all your taints. Listen to the perfect wisdom of the gentle Buddhas, taught for the weal of the world, for heroic spirits intended. And I woke up just really moved. And it was like, this is my teaching. And many of you will recognize that it's from the first verse of the Ratnaguna Sanchayagata, which is one of the Perfection of Wisdom's texts. And I'm not going to go into any analysis of this one verse. I mean, there's a lot out there. Ratnaguna and Ratnagosha both give amazing talks just on that verse even. And of course, there's Bhante's Wisdom Beyond Words. But for me, the essence of that particular verse is how to be receptive to the Dharma, to illumination and insight. And that's where I'm working at, how to be receptive. So it's about how to prepare the mind, but for me, it's about how to live my life, how to live a Dharma life, and particularly when difficulties arise, it's how to stay open to that. So that first line, call forth as much as you can of love, of respect, and of faith. To me, it's that first necessary step of transformation. And it's really beautiful, calling forth. It's like the qualities are already there, just need to call them forth, which actually can be a real shift of perception of oneself. Actually, these qualities can be cultivated further. And it's very tender, as much as you can. It's not saying you've got to have it all and you've got to have it all now. It's got to be perfect. It's just as much as you can, just summing it up. So yeah, it's also saying to me that the journey is an inner one. Really the spiritual life is nothing short of a radical transformation of how we see things, how we see the world, how we see reality in ourselves, and can discover things which we don't necessarily love or even like about ourselves. Well, I know I can. And that we've got attachments to all sorts of ideas that, well, we can see them as really not very substantial at all. And these are the obstructing defilements and taints that we really need to remove and clear away. They're our hindrances, well, they're mine. And it can be utterly terrifying, to sense that our egos may not just be sort of, I suppose, dissipated at the edges, but potentially completely destroyed. And I'm not there yet, because I must listen to the perfect wisdom of the gentle Buddhas, and that's the receptivity. And I guess if we're truly receptive, well, then anything's possible. And I love the line, the gentle Buddhas. It's a reminder that even though it can be difficult to have transformation, to have difficult experiences in life, dukkha, that actually it's done with love and gentleness, and it's taught for the weal of the world, the benefit of all beings. No one's left out. And finally, the last phrase, the heroic spirits intended, it stirs me so deeply. It's really, it's really calling on these qualities of love and respect and faith as heroic qualities. And they are heroic, both in the outer world and the inner world. And we can be so easily crushed by fear and doubt and become really small. And I know I can. And so why would heroic spirits be required? Well, because it's a journey. And I don't know about anyone else, but I've certainly experienced some times of the dark night of the soul in the spiritual journey, or the mythical forest. And for me, the opposite of love isn't actually hate, but fear. And so when fear rises, of which I've had experiences, sometimes in meditation, which can really overwhelm, and so much so I even passed out in a shrine room because I was so overwhelmed with the fear. What I need is love. And so how I'm working with this at the moment is calling on that both in myself and in others. And without going into great details, I was on a solitary retreat recently, just a few weeks ago. And the fear rose again, just like it had a few years ago when I fainted. And I didn't want to faint on my own, so I suppressed it and ended up with a really painful belly. A painful belly was what brought me to meditation 15 years ago. So I was like, well, that's not going to work. I know that doesn't work. So I worked really creatively with it. So I needed to call forth as much love, of respect and of faith. And I needed some heroic spirit. So I spent the next morning creating a shrine for Vajrasattva, who's the adamantine Buddha. And I chanted the 100-syllable mantra 108 times. It took a long time. And I did a visualization practice. You know, the whole thing was a real practice of faith, you know, to call forth all these qualities. And that night, when I did meditation in that shrine room again, and the fear rose, I called on Vajrasattva, and, you know, in visual form in my mind, he was there, and all those qualities were there, and they were part of me. So what it shows me is that it's possible. It's possible to transform conditioned reactions for me to fear. It could be anything. And try something a little bit more creative with the love, the respect and the faith. So yeah, I hope I've tried, I've tried to, and I hope I have conveyed a little bit of the magic of the Dharma, how it can just arrive in your life and then suddenly be there when you need it. And how it's just constantly evolving and unfolding. So I hope that you too can call forth love, respect and of faith. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Leah. Thank you. You certainly did convey very well and truly the magic of the Dharma, and really brought love and respect and faith into the Sangha Night. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much, Leah. I really enjoyed that too. Yeah, gosh, I mean, you think you choose when the Dharma comes to you, but it comes to you in dreams too. It's coming to get you. Great. So our next speaker, Archie, that is right, isn't it? Yeah, Archie is going to talk to us on the same title. So I'm really pleased Archie's going to be speaking. Archie lives over in Luton, but I've had the pleasure of getting to know him in bits, really, as he's become a Mitra, as he's talked about asking to join the ordination training process. And I think with Archie, what I always get a sense of with Archie is a man, a very considered man, a very sincere man. Whenever I talk to him, what he says, he's thought about, it's sort of weighed. So I get, it's a sort of lovely sort of quality. It slightly sort of takes you aback. You suddenly think, oh gosh, he's really thought about this. He's kind of considered this. So I think Archie's got a very strong feeling for principles, and wants to live a principle life. Is sort of working out whether he's doing that, if you see what I mean. So he's got that sort of sincerity to sort of really look at, how am I doing this? Am I doing this? And so what he says is sort of considered in that sort of way. So it's a lovely quality. So over to Archie. So Archie, you're muted, so you'll need to unmute. Otherwise, we'll get a little bit bored.
Apologies for that. Right. I just want to, first of all, to thank Arthur City, but also to thank Leah for what was really an inspiring talk. And certainly what came through for me is just how alive the Dharma is in her life. So when Arthur City asked me if I was willing to give a talk on the theme, the teaching that came to mind straight away was the teaching of the two arrows. I'm not quite sure when I first heard it. It was probably in one of the Letchworth sessions, which is my outreach group, which I've been attending for quite a number of years. What I do remember is a really strong, positive, emotional response to the teaching. I think I've had a habit, probably still do, of asking the so what question when I hear teachings for the first time, or at least some teachings for the first time. So I can hear a story and think, oh, that's interesting, or hear an idea and think that's fascinating. And then immediately what pops into my head is, well, so what? Is that going to make any difference to me? Can it make any difference to my life? In fact, I think I've probably been guilty at times of asking that question rather too bluntly. And I know that I'm very grateful to Yasudaka, who's led our group, for his patience and understanding, but also encouraging me and saying, you know, actually experiencing that and asking that is absolutely fine. What was really interesting, that when I heard the two arrow teaching for the first time, there was no so what. It just didn't arise. I immediately felt that here was something that could really make a difference to me. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, will be familiar with the teaching. As I understand it, what it's saying is that to be human is to suffer, to experience suffering at least some of the time. Jan of Archer, in his excellent talk last week, mentioned Viktor Frankl and his ideas on how we seek meaning in life. It was quite a coincidence because I literally had just finished reading Viktor Frankl's book a couple of days before the talk. And I was reading also, just before that, a book by another Holocaust survivor, Edith Eger, I think was her name. She went on to raise a family, to become a teacher, and even that, she felt she had more to give, and she wanted to use her own experience of suffering to reach out and help others who were currently suffering. So at quite a mature age, she started taking all the academic qualifications and then the professional qualifications that she needed to actually become a psychotherapist. And Viktor Frankl became, I believe, her mentor and her friend. Early on in her book, she is reflecting on what lessons she can draw from life. And one of the key lessons for her is that life does inevitably involve suffering. She says quite humorously, I thought, after all, where on your birth certificate does it say that life is going to be easy? Well, I was tempted to take mine out and check it, and I know there's not a statement of that nature there. And of course, she's not saying that all of life is suffering. The Buddha doesn't say that all of life is suffering. But to be human is to suffer. So that simply by the fact that I'm human, I am going to get hit by this first arrow. I mean, it might be sickness, it might be, in my case, very pertinent at the moment, getting old. It's inevitable, I'm human. In some situations, it's relatively trivial. So I regularly drive across town to visit my aging mum. And it's not unusual for me to get stuck behind a slow-moving vehicle. And all too frequently I get a really unpleasant jolt, that sort of first arrow. And I'm not sure that I would want to use the word suffering for that, but it's still an unpleasant experience. It's still that first arrow. Sadly, there are times when the word sorrow is absolutely appropriate, or suffering is absolutely appropriate. So 3 years ago, almost out of the blue, one of my younger brothers died. You know, I suffered. I had that first arrow. But all too frequently, what happens with me is that I then reach for a second arrow and stick that in. I start constructing all sorts of stories and things around that first arrow. So I actually land up increasing my pain. So one of the second arrows that I'm particularly prone to, and it sort of wings its way to me in all sorts of situations, is a sense of personal slight, a sense of perhaps injustice. It's my, oh, that's not fair reaction. So about 5 months ago, I'd made an online order that ran into some difficulties. So I got onto the online chat system, which was supposed to help me, and very rapidly became embroiled in a series of conversations that went on for days without any real sense of progress. And I was thinking, there I am, I'm being very reasonable. I'm always reasonable. Why are they treating me like this? And each conversation ended, as you can imagine, with more rumination, more storytelling that simply left me feeling really flat and really pretty negative. Yeah, my mindset was really negative at the end of each conversation. So we have the first arrow, and I have this tendency to almost gleefully reach out at times for a second arrow, simply to make things worse. Or if that's not my intention, they certainly do make things worse. So what was it that spoke to me in the teaching? And some of this happened fairly quickly, and other parts have sort of grown over time. So there are two particular things. The first one is about the first arrow, and the second one about the gap. So I'll talk about the gap first. I've had a deep interest in existentialism for a number of years. I was really drawn to its emphasis that I as an individual have freedom of choice as to how I decide to act. But along with that freedom comes a responsibility. I have to take full responsibility for my actions. And for years, that was or seemed to be a really good set of ethical principles to lead my life on. Until I came crashing into its limitations when my marriage began to fail, and did finally fail. I began to realize at that time that I wasn't some perfectly rational agent making decisions based on reason alone. In fact, I began to realize that most of my choices, most of my responses were knee-jerk, they were habitual, they were conditioned. What the teaching told me was that I still had a choice, but the choice was at a more fundamental level. It was around the gap. I didn't have to reach out for that second arrow. And that struck me as being so fundamental, because I realized its potential for it to really change my life, to really change the way that I am in the world. But it's not proven to be any magic wand. I'm more often than not aware enough of the gap. So I miss the opportunity, and I'll end up responding as I did in that online conversation. But not always. So about 3 months ago, another online purchase. I think there's a little story here, and perhaps something that I need to address: online purchases as a way of coping with lockdown and the pandemic. But in this case, it was a birthday present for my son, and I'd deliberately ordered it several weeks early, and it didn't come. So I went online, this time by email, to say, quite politely, it hasn't come. Can you tell me what's going on? And they responded, and I think the words they used were, there is a slight delay of 7 weeks. And I had to take a deep breath, a really deep breath. So I was left with two choices. One very straightforward. Did I cancel the order? Very straightforward. But much more importantly was the choice: did I allow myself to slip into some extended storytelling that would simply make my initial disappointment so much worse? Well, I have to be honest, I can't say there was absolutely no storytelling, but it was relatively short-lived, and it never really got hold of me. So the second thing that really spoke to me in the teaching is around the first arrow. I was raised as a Catholic. One of my early memories about that process is standing behind my school desk. I think I was probably 5 or going on 6 at the time, and trying to recite the Holy Catechism off by heart. So I believe in one God, God the Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. But I'm now aware, and I was then, of the dread and fear that I felt of getting that wrong. And then there's the experience of my first confession. It may not have been exactly my first one, but it was certainly one of my early ones. And it's still too difficult in some ways to talk about in this sort of company, but it's left a really unpleasant memory. And this is more than 55 years ago. So I think those type of experiences left me with a residual, almost cloying sense of guilt in situations where I simply shouldn't feel guilty. And what the first arrow did, it helped me to realize that as a human being like everybody else, I was simply deeply conditioned in so many ways. So I didn't need to keep judging myself, particularly on those occasions when I judged myself harshly. I didn't need to do that. I could actually be more caring about myself. And gradually over time, I came to realize that it's just so much healthier to accept where I am, take responsibility for it, and to work on those things that I need to work on. And I suppose in some ways that's my theory. The actual practice is obviously a lot more challenging, but I genuinely believe that I'm taking steps, albeit small steps, but I am taking those steps in the right direction.
Thanks very much, Archie. Sorry. Oh, great. You just come to the end, have you? Thank you very much, Archie. Very, very heartfelt and very, very urgent talk there. Thanks very, 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 very much. And our next speaker, Stephen. I'll be brief. Actually, I would like to say more, Stephen, but just in view of time, I'll hand over. I will say though, Stephen has built at least one violin and is at least on his second if he hasn't finished it. So this is a man who has stick at it. He's also got a great sort of sense of sensitivity, I'd say, great feeling of sensitivity and eloquence as well. So over to Stephen. Thanks very much for giving this talk.
Oh, thanks, Archie. And thank you, Leah and Archie, for your talks as well. This is written out, so it's very fixed length. I'll just talk really fast. So, having been asked to give this talk, I went through what appears to be a standard first action for me. What actually have I been asked to talk about? As Rilke said, try to love the questions themselves. So that's what I'm going to do, and hopefully there'll be an answer at the end as well. So, a Dharma teaching that has changed my life. Not much of an ask then, is it? Something life-changing in 10 minutes. I was initially a bit concerned about finding a specific teaching that was life-changing. Unfortunately, I haven't had a moment like Maha Kassapa, where a lotus has been presented and I've experienced immediate awakening. And then I could say, that's the bit where my life changed. Life appears to me to be a big, messy thing, and there's lots of wrestling and untangling to do there and try and make sense of it. So to try and find a thing that has changed, it is no straightforward task. And I was thinking perhaps there's a sutta from the Pali Canon or an excerpt from one of Bante's talks that I've come across. And again, there's an awful lot to choose from. Is it something I've heard or read, or did I see it in a YouTube video? So a YouTube video that changed my life, that'd be a Sangha Night first, wouldn't it? And change. Is change in itself a good thing? I'm sure there would be some concern, or at least raised eyebrows, if I talked about a Dharma teaching that changed my life significantly for the worse. Or maybe not. Maybe better or worse is best something to work out later when I've had a bit more life under my belt. Or perhaps the scale of the change, something dramatic to grip the audience, or how my life has changed. The value of life reminded me of Jnana Varcha's talk last week, of how life's value could be seen as having meaning, and perhaps I should reflect on meaning in and of my life and how that's changed. So after all that waffle, what have I got? What did I come up with? You might be pleased to hear that it's not a talk about a YouTube video that dramatically changed the meaning of my life. What actually came up was friendship. And to be honest, that answer did come quite quickly, but I was hesitant to jump on it because it seemed too mundane, even quite banal. But having started to reflect and unpack the teaching of friendship and how it's changed my life, it soon became apparent that there was a greater significance than I first expected. So first off, to measure change, there is a before and an after. And in my young adult years, my before period, so to speak, I didn't have many friends. The standard metric I usually pulled out was that in those times I had one friend and I saw them twice a year. To be honest, it is hard to be sure of the absolute accuracy of such statements, and I'm sure it's been coloured by the negativity of the time, and perhaps I did have literally more than one friend, but there is a certain truth in that statement nonetheless. And of course, I should note that the number of friends one has is not necessarily a measure of one's friendship or friendliness, spiritual attainment, or even general well-being. This is not a tale of how many more Facebook friends I now have because of my Dharma practice. Regardless of whether I had one friend or 1 million friends, looking back at my before state, I can see now how my general friendlessness was born out of the view that my relationship to myself, the world, and between them was one of being an island in a sea of islands. I was separate from others and internally invisible, and from this, only I knew what was good for me. Supporting in turn, this was a lack of self-love, or even a preponderance for self-hatred, one might say, where my perceived value to the world and others was at best zero, and sometimes even less. And so it was one day that I stepped over the threshold of the Cambridge Buddhist Centre. This act was one of searching for well-being, and as you might have guessed from the perhaps overly negative description of myself, I wasn't what you might call a happy bunny. As for this well-being I was looking for, it was very much in line with my views at the time, a well-being that served myself and my own happiness, that was an escape from the painful thoughts and feelings I encountered in my life, and that was safely fenced by a set of personal practices that I could do in the quiet of my own room, preferably with my eyes closed. It wasn't that friendship was low on the list, it was that it wasn't even on the list. So that's the before bit. So what about the teaching? So after a period of time spent within the community of Triratna, it's highly likely, perhaps even inevitable, that you'll come across a particular sutra based upon the teaching of spiritual friendship. And thus soon came the day when it was my turn to hear it. And it goes like this. Friendship is half of the spiritual life, Lord. Say not so, Ananda. Friendship is the whole of the spiritual life. I'm sure many people will recognize this abridged excerpt from the Upada Sutta in the Pali Canon. And so here was the teaching that was going to change my life, apparently. I will have to confess a little eye rolling whenever I hear it, given the frequency it's reeled out. Perhaps that's a working ground for me. And upon first hearing it, my reaction was not one of a welcoming with outstretched arms. Indeed, my arms were quite firmly folded, at least internally anyway. On the outside, I expect I was wearing the usual forced smile of someone frozen with discomfort, wanting to melt away or disappear. And my rationalization was that this was something fluffy and superfluous, perhaps overly sentimental, maybe even a means of groupthink to assimilate me into the community. I feared for my own independence. But perhaps that wasn't really when I first heard this teaching of friendship. So I'd like to rewind back to where I believe I'd actually received this teaching. And it was also probably the first of all the teachings I received. It was received when first stepping through the door of the Buddhist center and being greeted. In this case, for me, it was Lalita Vajra, and I still remember it to this day with his grinning face, smiling eyes and cheerful voice. I thought he must have had a very good day as he was very happy. Either that or a bit weird. And really that's not a joke, as my view of the world was steeped in transaction. Friendly people were friendly because they wanted something from you. He seemed rather satisfied in himself without need for approval. And that was weird for me. And so it followed on with a succession of encounters. So the Mitra convener of the time, Vajrapriya, came with more unnerving friendliness, which I met with deep suspicion. I built friendships with the order members who are running the meditation drop-ins, Manjurav and Nageshwar, who are now a fellow community member and Kalyana Mitra respectively. And over time, a network of relationships started to form. And the prevailing attitude for me now was one of pleasure, where I finally found myself in the company of others, in relation to others, that had the opportunity, to my limited extent at the time, to express outwards what I felt inwards. There was a real pull in that direction. It felt good. At the same time, there was some limitation here in my search for pleasure, and I was still using people as a means to an end to satisfy my own desires. Not that I was aware of that at the time. And moving on, about a year after stepping through those doors, I joined together with other men for the start of the Mitra study group. I can recall with clarity my initial reaction being one of, these people aren't the kind of people I spend time with. Until then, my social world had been a controlled environment. My model of friendship was coloured perhaps by a superficial view of gain and loss, like the border control of a nation state where immigrants have their passports and credentials checked to see if they meet the necessary conditions, otherwise they're not allowed in. So these other Mitras, these others of the Mitra study group, had well and truly crossed my borders and were setting up residency, albeit once a week. And it was in this process that over time, the cardboard cutout models of people I hastily constructed started to wither and fall away, replaced by something more fleshy, rounded and complicated, more human. Through the simple act of having to spend time with these people, my model of what makes us human, what a person is and what is valuable in a person started to broaden, and judgments about what made someone worthy of friendship started to soften. The complications and messiness became a thing of interest rather than something to turn away from. Not that it was all easy. I'd like to paint a rosy picture and say through that time I flourished and bloomed into a beautiful, friendly being. But the reality was that even after all that time in the group work was still hard, but it gave me a wider vision, a broader context to my practice as a Buddhist. It was also the start of the process of turning inwards and developing an awareness of my own experience, and from there developing a friendliness towards myself. The friendship that I was experiencing externally transformed into a development of internal friendship. It was through the reflection of myself and others and their kindly non-judgmental support that slowly the view of my internal experience and narrative, rather than being wrong in a fixed way, was actually part of a broader tapestry of life which we all shared. this predicament of human experience which I'd been pushing away was not only not personal to me, but actually a means of connecting with others. The things I'd been turning away from were the very things we shared. Living in community has provided experience of friendship that has gone deeper than the study group, for virtue of sharing much more than a few hours a week. The decision to move into community was as much a decision to move away from the living situation I was in. And I certainly was coming in review as to how I could keep relations at an appropriate arm's length and keep a healthy sense of my individual identity. Community too has certainly been difficult at times, and it's been those difficult periods that my sharp views of self and other, right and wrong, continue to have their edges softened by staying within that space and working through rather than running away. Like when in an evening I may feel so upset with myself or others that I cannot find myself able to speak, or may even be tearful or angry, and that can be met by others when I don't have the resources myself to skillfully navigate what I'm experiencing. And again, through that external friendship, the internal friendship goes, the friendship with my own being. And I thank friends over the years who've been quite clear with me that when I'm moaning about needing to live my own life or have more freedom, that I should stick it out. Who knows, that happens, what happens in those parallel universes of our unlived choices. But there is some confidence in me that I'm all the better for sticking it out in this one. And as the external friendship I receive transforms the relationship I have with myself to one of kindness and acceptance, so too does my internal transformation touch and reach out externally as I befriend others and help them befriend themselves. Family relations which may have been distant become imbued with meaning and love. People who I previously thought as other become known to me and I to them. And so too do those other inner transformations continue to radiate out, colouring inner and outer alike in ever-growing circles. In his last years, Bante took to reading the physicist Carlo Rivelli as a means of brushing up on his scientific knowledge. For me, the most striking words from Rivelli were about the ephemeral nature of measured reality at the quantum level. He says, "The world is made up of a network of kisses, not of stones." What he was getting to was that reality is made up of relationships. Nothing exists in and of itself. It's at the boundaries where the magic happens. And I think it no coincidence that he chose the kiss as a metaphor, an act of human affection. It's not just that the world is made up of relationships or fixed things, but that with the kiss, the world comes from the ground of love, the deepest arising of friendship. Friendship is half of the spiritual life, Lord. Say not so, Ananda. Friendship is the whole of the spiritual life. And I still squirm when I hear that, but that's okay. I know I still have much distance to travel, but I'm happier where I am now than I was before, a better friend to myself. And reflecting back on the teaching that changed my life, it turns out that the sutta about friendship isn't the thing that's changed my life, but friendship itself.
Many thanks, Stephen. Very, very beautiful, very, very touching, and a lovely sense of ironic, the ironic comic thrown in there. Really, very lovely talk. We're going to go straight into groups, and it's a chance for you to say, what is it in the Dharma that's really made the difference for you? Of course, as Stephen says, that's a searching question. It may be that it's the first time you've come along this evening. Well, what brought you along? So we can explore those two